welcome. I'm Cassidy Cash, and this is the channel where we go behind the curtain and into the real life and history of William Shakespeare to find out what it was like to live in turn of the 17th century England the way Shakespeare would have lived it. If you like history and you like Shakespeare, then this is the place for you. Hit that like and subscribe button because we're here every week. This week, we're going to explore fruit from the 17th century by looking at what kind of apples were growing in England when Shakespeare was walking around there. Let's find out right now on That Shakespeare Life. The word apple comes up 9 times in Shakespeare's plays, and in many of these references, he talks about crab apples, rotten apples, and even cutting an apple in half. But what does this mean about the fruit for Shakespeare's lifetime? Did Shakespeare eat apples? And if so, what kind? To find out the answer to these questions, I sat down with Nigel and Alison Deacon, who are working in England to preserve not only heritage apples, but historical ones as well. I asked them about what kind of apples were growing in England during Shakespeare's lifetime, and here's what they had to say.
Well, the short answer is yes, of course, there were wild apples, but the apple isn't actually native to England. So you need to know how apples got here in the first place before we start talking about wild apples. Some of our well-known apples arose as chance seedlings. So in a sense, some of our present apples are actually wild apples. I don't know whether people realise that the apple evolved in Kazakhstan over millions of years. And there are still pockets of fruit forests there with wild apples of all sorts, all sizes, large to small, all colours, green to dark purple skin, almost black, some of them, bitter to sweet, and with all sorts of different flavours. And there's also sour apples, which are known as crabs. So in prehistoric times, apples dispersed the seeds, which meant they didn't get far and stayed more or less in Kazakhstan. But later they were spread by man. So there were important trade routes from Asia to Europe, including the Silk Road. And the fruit would have been taken by the traders and eaten on the way. So when you eat apples, you tend to throw away the core, and apple trees grow from the pips if it's cold enough. So that enabled the fruit to travel to Europe, and eventually apples reached Rome. From Rome, they spread to all parts of the Roman Empire, and apples still spread like this today. So we see them along old roads and railway banks, in hedges, and even new roads. It's not long before you see apple trees growing there. And some of these ancient roads have been in use since the Romans were here. We used to drive along an old road, an old Roman road, which is called the Fosse Way, to see my parents, who live about 70 miles away. And one year, on the 4th of January, we counted 80 apple trees with no leaves, but actually full of fruits. So that's quite late in the season and gives you an idea about how many apple trees there must be. So to answer your original question, there were 2 sorts of apples growing wild in Shakespeare's day. The large sweet apples descended from those in Kazakhstan with variable quality, but often quite good. And then crab apples, which haven't really changed much over centuries. They're always sour and green, and they also come from Kazakhstan.
These answers were part of a larger conversation on the history of apples for Shakespeare's lifetime that we've put into a podcast interview with Nigel and Alison Deacon. And you can listen to this entire conversation about apple orchards, apple farmers, cooking apples in the 16th century, recipes that they would have made with them, and so much more in the whole podcast episode. Listen right now at CassidyCash.com/episode 284. While you're there, if you'd like to see bonus history about apples in Shakespeare's lifetime, including some primary documents that talk about those recipes and even farming techniques from Shakespeare's lifetime, then hit the Become a Patron button on the show notes page. The button allows you to join us as a patron or to log in if you're already a supporter of our show. You can use your Patreon credentials there, and all of this extra history will expand right on the page. That's it for this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.